Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, Determining Moral Behavior. This is the first of two narrated slideshows for Chapter 2. This chapter sets out to define various ethical systems, or it also uses the term moral theories or moral philosophies. Essentially, it is the systematic ordering of moral principles. It's the framework that we use to answer the question of why we believe something is right or wrong. And the text sets out these various characteristics of what an ethical system has to have to be considered an ethical system. Some of these are pretty self-explanatory. They have to be internally consistent, consistent with generally held beliefs. They have to be based on some type of moral common sense. But this next term, prescriptive, they cannot be abstract. It can't just be a gathering of good and bad principles. It has to describe what behavior is required and what behavior is prohibited. It has to be applicable. It has to be authoritative. In other words, once someone subscribes to an ethical system, it has to govern decision making in multiple areas. It has to be logically impartial or universal, and by that they mean that it's not relative. What's true for one person has to be true for everyone. And finally, it can't be self-serving. It can't be just focused on the individual holding it. It has to apply to behavior directed for others, for the good of others. So the text uses this term ethical pyramid. In fact, the text includes a picture of this, figure 2.1 of the current edition. And the idea is this, is that we reach moral judgments about people, and the example they give is that parents who go out and party and leave their young kids at home are bad. They're bad people and bad parents. Well, so where does that moral judgment come from? Well, that judgment comes from a series of moral rules that we subscribe to. And so to make that judgment, we would probably believe that people shouldn't get drunk, that children should come as a priority for parents before themselves, and they ought to take care of their kids, and that's the duty of a parent. Okay, so those are moral rules. Well, where do those moral rules come from? The rules have to come from some ethical system, and that's the base. That's the foundation. And that ethical system could be a number of things, and those are ones we're going to look at later on in this chapter. So put another way, looking at the pyramid from the ground up, everyone has to have an ethical system, and that ethical system then produces moral rules that govern behavior. And using those moral rules, we then make moral judgments about our behavior and the behavior of others. So the first ethical system we're going to look at is this idea of ethics of virtue. It comes from Aristotle, and essentially it was Aristotle's purpose to define what makes a good person. And Aristotle believed that to be a good person, you can't just think good things, you actually have to do good things. You have to do good deeds. And he believed that the point of all of this, the point of ethics of virtue, was to have what he called eudaimonia. It's a general well-being and flourishing, and it's living a good life and reaching goals and having moral excellence. And so one of the foundations that Aristotle had is that people are neither good or evil from birth, but they develop that goodness or evilness through the practice of habits. And obviously that is different than biblical Christianity, which believes that people are inherently evil and sinful from birth. Aristotle held a different view, essentially that people are born a blank slate, and they develop goodness or evilness through the practice of their behavior. He believed that to be a good person, that person had to have certain virtues, and the text lists these: thriftiness, temperance, humility, industriousness, and honesty. Aristotle went on to break down these virtues, or excellences as he called them, between intellectual virtues, wisdom and understanding, and moral virtues such as generosity and self-control. He developed this principle of the golden mean that the text describes. Essentially, it is following a virtue between two extremes, and we'll look at some examples of those in a minute. Aristotle's point was that people become virtuous by habit, by performance, by essentially continuing to exercise those virtues in a good way and making good decisions over a period of time and repeatedly. It's training, like physical training, except that it's character training, that good virtue, that a good person is developed and proven over time by making repeated good decisions over and over, versus the opposite of a bad person being someone who continues to make bad decisions over the period of a lifetime. And this chart taken from the text essentially shows the golden mean applied by looking at some of the things that we consider virtues and then looking at what the extremes of that virtue look like, such as courage. Obviously one extreme would be cowardice, but the other extreme of courage would be just foolhardiness and rushing off into danger. But in the middle, in the golden mean, lies courage. Another one down there below, good temper, right? Being in the mean between someone who's quick to grow angry and then between someone who's just entirely passive, who has no passion about them whatsoever. But someone who has that passion but maintains it has this virtue of good temper. And then this virtue of truthfulness lies between unkind truthfulness and dishonesty. So this is pretty funny if you think about it, because there have been some people in your life who were truthful to the point of unkindness. They basically had the gift of blatant honesty and would tell you what they thought about you, whether it was kind or not. And then obviously the other extreme would be someone who just lies for the purpose of lying, and the virtue of truthfulness lies somewhere in between. So it's an interesting chart to go through and look at what the extremes of that behavior appear to be at either side. And the text also notes this study done by the Josephson Institute of Ethics, where they put forth what they call these 6 pillars of character. And these are essentially similar to Aristotle's virtues, but just laid out in more modern language. So Aristotle's ethics of virtue was good in the abstract, and it was it seemed to be a good ethical system, but there are problems, and the problems come in the application. It's one thing to talk about all of these values and these virtues that one should have and that one should govern their behavior by, but the problem is when the rubber meets the road. This comes up when a person has to decide between the primacy of these moral values, right? What happens when these two values come into conflict? And the example would be when honesty and loyalty come into conflict, and when you're having to make a decision in your professional life, when you're having to resolve an ethical dilemma. How do you choose between these two competing virtues, or these virtues that may come into conflict? And we'll look at that in some examples down the road. The problem with Aristotle's system was that there was no basis to apply it. Good in the abstract, not very good in terms of being able to make application of this system in living day-to-day life. So what followed Aristotle's ethical system of virtue was this idea of natural law as an ethical system. And essentially natural law stands for the concept that there's this universal system of right and wrong it parallels a lot of religious beliefs, but the distinction is in natural law doesn't turn on a particular supernatural figure. There is no God in natural law. That instead morality just comes from this natural order of the universe that tends to be consistent across cultures throughout the ages. It is based on this idea that whatever is natural therefore has to be good. And therefore anything that's good is then going to come naturally to people. And it turns on some kind of generally accepted good things, that we're supposed to take care of ourselves and others, right? We're supposed to look out for others, generally speaking. We do what's best for society, generally speaking, and that it's generally good to advance in terms of knowledge and wisdom and understanding. These are all considered to be good things. As with any ethical system, there are problems with natural law, and just as with Aristotle, the problem comes in the application. The essential difficulty is, okay, so if natural law says that whatever is natural is good, and that whatever is good must be natural, then who gets to decide what is natural and good? That varies based upon your situation. Throughout history, the idea of natural law has been abused, obviously, and probably the most notorious would be where one race decides that it is naturally superior to other races and therefore can subjugate those races. This idea of white supremacy and Aryanism certainly holds to the idea that, well, naturally we believe that we're superior to the other races, therefore it must be good for us to act on that. And the text gives other examples as well. The fundamental problem is, if we're going to say that something is natural and is therefore good, how do we know if we're identifying what is truly natural or basically acting on our biases and just on our perception of what natural is? Another way to put that is, if what is natural is good, then who gets to decide and define what is natural? The text next defines another ethical system under the broad umbrella of religion. Essentially, a religion is an ethical system that provides general moral guidelines in terms of how we're supposed to live our life. That these religious ethics, these guidelines for our life, tend to come from a God who is both willful and fundamentally rational. Now, obviously, not all religions are monotheistic like Christianity and Judaism and Islam. There are certainly non-monotheistic religions and pantheistic religions, but generally the idea is what is good is defined based on a religious system that identifies such things as good and evil, and that which is good is consistent with the will of God. The text further identifies the fact that many of the major religions throughout the world and throughout history do have some basic moral principles that are consistent throughout. Obviously, the rule in Christianity, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, can be seen in other religions as well. And again, the text raises this interesting question when it comes to religion and determining what is good. Does God prohibit conduct because it's inherently wrong, or does he say that we should do things a certain way because it is inherently right? Or are those things wrong or right just because God says that it is? The text gives short shrift to these big issues, and obviously these are discussions that should be had in much greater detail, and so this is just really a glossing over. The text does identify these couple of different ways of looking at religion. One is the legalistic approach, in that God is consistent in the same, and so the questions of God's will are absolute and they don't change from situation to situation, versus the situationalist idea that God's will can change over time, and that something that may have been wrong in one situation may not necessarily be wrong in another situation. Now, the problem is, obviously, for any religion is, how do we determine what God's will is? And the text identifies these three big umbrella ideas. That one, God's will is determined through the individual conscience or our faith, but the problem with that is that places great weight on the individual, And so what happens when the individual is inherently corrupt or has a skewed viewpoint about what is right or wrong? Then how reliable can that individual's determination of God's will be, and therefore how reliable can that ethical system be? Other ways of determining what God's will would be considering what did the religious authorities say that God's will is. The problem comes with that in that if you have a reliable religious authority, that's good. If you have a corrupt or a corruptible religious authority, then that compromises the integrity of knowing God's will and therefore compromises the fundamental ethical system based on that. And finally, how do we determine God's will? Well, then we can rely on Holy Scriptures, and then we have to dig down to the question of, well, how reliable are those Scriptures if we're going to say that God's will can be determined from them? Obviously, all major issues that deserve lots and lots of discussion, but are outside the scope of this chapter in this course, essentially. But the fundamental point being is that religion does form a major basis of how we structure our ethical systems. Next, we look at ethical formalism, primarily espoused by Immanuel Kant. Ethical formalism focuses on this idea of duty. It is a deontological system, which means that essentially it's not so concerned with the ends, which would be a teleological system, which we'll look at in the next set of slides, but this system instead focuses on the intent of the actor. Essentially, as long as the intention of the act was good, then whether that act is good or not is judged based on the intent, not necessarily what it results in. So the idea under ethical formalism is that if one intends to do good, then one is doing good, regardless of whether a bad result happens. Conversely, if one commits an act based on a bad intent, then it is inherently an immoral act, even if it just happens to end up producing a good result. So under ethical formalism, Kant distinguished between two imperatives, one that he called a categorical imperative, compared with basically its opposite, the hypothetical imperative. And categorical imperatives are those things that must be done regardless of a person's situation, attitude, intended result. It's conduct that should be done, such as always tell the truth, or conduct that shouldn't be done, such as don't steal. That's the idea of identifying morality through a categorical imperative. Now that's compared with a hypothetical imperative, which Kant described as conduct that one follows if they want to accomplish a certain end. In other words, if we want a desired result, then we're going to act a certain way, or if we don't want a desired result, then we're not going to act that way. If we want somebody to like us, then we're going to be kind and friendly towards them. So under Kant's categorical imperative of morality, there are some basic principles, and the text identifies these three. The first is, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And what that means is, if you're going to say that something is right in this situation, then you have to be willing to follow that to its logical conclusion and say that that conduct is going to be right in any other situation for anybody else. The text gives the example of if a student decides to cheat on a test and say that that's moral, then that student has to be willing to say that that decision to cheat on a test is true and moral for anyone at any time. The second principle is, act in such a way that you are always treating humanity, whether in your own person or that of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. In other words, if we believe that conduct is moral, then it has to be moral for its own sake. It can't be conduct that we're going to act in a certain way for our own purposes. In other words, if we think that it is moral to be charitable, then that act is inherently moral in itself, and we don't act charitably just because it is going to do good for us down the road, that it's going to give us a break on our taxes or going to make us look good in front of other people. And finally, this principle, act as if you were, through your maxims, a lawmaking member of a kingdom of ends. Essentially saying that if we're going to say that our actions are good, then we have to be saying that those acts are done freely, that we're not doing good because we have to do good, but essentially that we're doing good because we believe that conduct is truly good and that we're not being coerced or compelled to engage in that conduct. Like every ethical system, ethical formalism has its shortcomings. It's an absolutist system. In other words, under ethical formalism, if we say that something is wrong, then that conduct is wrong all the time and in every situation. The example here on the slide, if killing is wrong, then it would also be wrong to kill an evil person. To assassinate Hitler to keep the Holocaust from happening would still be wrong and immoral because killing's wrong. Kant also gave the example that if someone was hiding from an attacker who was following them and they came to you and asked to be hidden, and then the attacker asks us, hey, where's this person? Then it would be immoral or wrong for us to lie because lying is inherently wrong. And so the problem again lies in application. The problem again lies in when the rubber meets the road and how do we live out ethical formalism. Kant got around it by basically crawfishing on what he really meant and saying that, well, truths and lies could be distinguished a certain way. Conduct could be justified based on one's intention, that kind of thing. He essentially used semantics to try and defend this ethical system against its critics. And the primary criticisms of this system identified in the text is, one, every rule has an exception, so we can't always say that certain conduct is always going to be bad. Ethical formalism doesn't work under what's called extreme circumstances, where situations are complex and the answer may not be so clear and simple. And if morality under ethical formalism is defined as duty, then it's basically a baseline ethical system, and it doesn't leave room for conduct that is higher than that, for us to aspire to higher behaviors of good, setting higher standards of good, if all we're required to do is our basic duty. And finally, if we are to judge whether an act is moral or not based on intent, and we simply ignore the consequences that come from that act, then it's a very simplistic ethical system. You can't just ignore what's going to result, and you can't truly judge whether conduct is right or wrong in terms of whether or not the actor had good intentions at the beginning.